Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, October 29th, 2021. I don't know why I can't get the hang of saying the year and the date. It's 21 years since I've had to get used to this, and okay. For whatever reason, that trips me up in the morning. Well, good morning, everybody. It's this will be our last October broadcast for the year. I guess this wraps things up. Kids are excited all across America. I guess because Halloween this weekend, and it comes on Sunday, and around here, our kids have school off Monday, not because of Halloween, although that would be great. And I've had, there have been kids that I've spoken to about this who have recommended that the day after Halloween ought to be a holiday off from school. And this year they get their wish. And this year there's some kind of crazy scheduling going on. We will ordinarily have off from school for these kids on Tuesday, Election Day. I've never had confirmation of it, but I always imagined that this was because the elections, the polling places, very often in the schools, and they just didn't really love the idea of leaving the school doors open for random adults from the neighborhood to wander in and out the doors while the kids were in school. And then at some point they decided, well, if the school's going to be closed on Saturday, Sunday, and then closed again on Tuesday, we might as well close it on Monday and make some use of that. And then, I don't know, this year, I don't know what happened. But as you know, things are crazy over at the Loudoun County School Board already. So maybe that had something to do with it. We'll get back to that in a minute. But anyway, they've got lots and lots of time off. So that should be fun and interesting, and will disrupt it should make the morning routine easier, but because it's no longer the routine, who knows what's going to happen. So we'll see. Maybe we'll forget to do the show, I don't know, tomorrow and the next day, for instance. And then where would we be? All right, the Kagro in the Morning radio show is live this morning. Kagro X, me, David Waldman. I'm telling you this in the third person because I'm reading Bill's morning tweet. This morning, you, someone else, has set up his broadcast booth inside the Pope's giant hat. What a great place to be, by the way, to live cast his meeting with President Biden. Is that happening? Excellent. Keep your finger on that bleep button, David. I hear it could get salty. That's possible. This is one of the saltier popes. I didn't even know that was the case, so thanks for bringing that to my attention. I was wondering why somebody was saying this. I just figured it was generally true all the time. And I saw someone tweeting today. Who tweeted this today? Isaac Lamb. Okay. In response to Chris Geidner tweeting about the Supreme Court's work just, I guess, yesterday. On a 5-3 vote, Chris reports the Supreme Court, unlike in other cases, jumped in to reverse a lower court's procedural decision, this time in a case that means a man almost certainly will be killed by the state of Oklahoma tonight. This, a tweet from yesterday afternoon, so maybe it was yesterday afternoon that the court issued its ruling. And the execution, I guess, was supposed to go forward last night. And I have no update on that. But I did see that flash across the screen because, Oklahoma, the way it came across my screen, Oklahoma resuming its program of executions after, I think, 2 or 3 botched lethal injection executions in a row because they're having difficulty getting the court rulings on cruel and unusual punishment and the particular mix of drugs that they were using for lethal injection. And now it's impossible to know whether the injections you're using are going to be effective, and by which they mean kill somebody, but hopefully without undue pain and discomfort. But I don't know how you get around to that you're going to die in the end of this, so you're probably a little uncomfortable with this. Anyway, I just, to bring it back around to the news of the visit with the Pope, Isaac Lamb tweeting in response to this, cut to exactly 0 Catholic bishops threatening to withhold communion from Amy Coney Barrett or Brett Kavanaugh. Yeah, true. And one of their favorite tricks when they're meeting, say, with President Biden, to threaten to withhold communion because of his stance on abortion. But never mind that one about capital punishment. What can you do? People pick and choose. That's sort of the way it goes these days. All right. Well, speaking as I was about for the past 10 days about what's going on in the craziness surrounding the Loudoun County School Board, now a national issue, of course. I spotted something last night that made me think perhaps we would do well to revisit some of that story. Last night, let's see, how did I get to this? I'm going to have to sort of walk my way through it. But I guess I was looking in on various aspects of the story when I noticed, let's see, I should scroll through my own Twitter timeline to see if I can get to this. But I noticed the story of one of the Loudoun County School Board members recently resigned. And there was, of course, a lot of talk about it and a lot of fanfare about it. And it was related to the circumstances surrounding the case we've been talking about for the past several days, including centering on the attacks on Loudoun County school properties. You remember when we described, I don't want to get too much into the detail of it all over again first thing in the morning, but and reaction to it by parents, and then drumming it up into conflating it into an issue about permitting transgender students to use the bathroom that matches their gender identity, even though that apparently, in hindsight anyway, now that we've been able to sort things out, doesn't appear to have anything at all to do with it. That didn't stop Republicans in the Judiciary Committee either from grilling as we mentioned the other day, a appeals court judge, a nominated judge from California who had, no particular interest in and no particular knowledge of what was going on in Loudoun County, grilling her about that. And that continued when Attorney General Merrick Garland appeared before them. Of course, he would have been aware, but they were grilling him over, in chief, his memo directing the FBI and federal law enforcement to look into how it might be able to assist and train local law enforcement to deal with the surge in, surge in disruptions, the surge in violence, the surge in threats leveled against school board members and public health officials and public elections officials of all kinds, but in particular the outbursts at the local school board level, and that we ought to be, doing what we can to help them deal with the flood of threats. And right wing and Republican members of the Judiciary Committee, of course, taking that and running with it and saying, what's really happening here is you are using the apparatus of the state to suppress free speech and to tell parents that they shouldn't have anything to do with how the school board operates and how their kids are educated, which is, the usual conflation of everything. And anyway, I just happened to see circulating on Twitter this clip of Senator Mike Lee from Utah. And I don't know if he was directly addressed or rebutted in the hearing, because I didn't get to watch the whole hearing. But this one clip of Mike Lee saying that the FBI shouldn't get involved in local school board meetings because there has been, quote, no explicit death threat, which was a pretty obvious falsehood at the time, if not just outright lie. And I was just curious about whether anybody called him out on it, because it's actually been rather famously the case that there are plenty of explicit death threats being leveled at school board members, in our case here, the school superintendent as well, local elected officials of all kinds, and it's been going on for quite some time, all the way through the pandemic when people were making explicit death threats against state and local health officials who were enforcing various mitigation practices. Anyway, I just found this to be a particularly pernicious and horrible lie, given the nature of the threats actually being received by school board members. And I thought we'd do well to put them side by side and just show people, because like I said, I was following up on the story and reading a local piece about the resignation of one of the school board members, which, by the way, that's been the demand of the angry parents and protesters all along, that these school board members and the superintendent resign. Or that's been the most vocal or most frequently voiced demand. Usually then followed up by they should also be killed in horrific ways. And, that's where the problem lies. Anyway, this one board member apparently did resign. And by the way, that didn't actually fix anything for her. They all demanded that she resign. She agreed to do so and did resign. And by the way, well, we should look into, she didn't agree to do so, but she did resign. And that hasn't stopped anybody from saying, well, now she should be prosecuted and possibly killed as well. So never taking yes for an answer, as usual. The crazy crowds just kept pressing her. I say she didn't agree to resign because there was some, I guess there was some doubt for the first couple of days. Maybe because I didn't read her statement directly. She probably, I imagine, would have been very clear in her statement given the circumstances. But the reporting in the first couple of days was, well, she agrees that the case was mishandled, and that's why she's resigning. And while she may actually agree that the case was mishandled, it seems to me pretty clear from this story from the Loudoun Times-Mirror that she has a slightly different view of how she came around to resigning. I guess we'll just read through it. And then while reading through this, you'll get an idea of the sort of threats that are being leveled. And I want you to compare that. Keep in mind, Senator Mike Lee saying there haven't been any death threats. Or as he says, no, what did he say? Credible death threats? And I don't even know how you even qualify that. Explicit, not okay. So no explicit death threats, which I really, honestly, I don't know what his definition would be. Anyway, the name of the school board member in question here, I believe, is Beth Bartz. So here's the headline here. Bart's resignation came amid threats. And you'll see from the story, came because of the threats. Again, it wasn't because, well, this is such a debacle, I will resign. It was, you guys are threatening me so frequently, I'm scared for my life and I will resign. Bart's resignation came amid threats. LCPS acknowledges school board received numerous threats. Remember where Mike Lee was that there were none? And now it turns out that there are numerous? All right, well, Horus Alas, I guess, is I'm hoping for the pronunciation being correct, as the writer of the piece here. Again, for the local paper, the Loudoun Times-Mirror, there's a couple of, there's an art graphic of printouts of the various threat letters, some with some redactions in there, but like I say, an art thing. Like they've mocked it up so that they look like they're on torn paper somehow for some reason. Although really it actually looks like they printed them on drywall and pulled chunks of drywall. I don't know. So I didn't mean to be critical of the art direction of the piece here, but I guess we know who's responsible, because you know how they do it with the little captions, and they put the credit for like a photo credit. Kim Butler. And we got to talk about your art direction here. I didn't mean to single you out, but anyway, this is a little bit weird. Loudoun County Public Schools officials confirmed to the Times-Mirror on Wednesday that school board members have been receiving violent threats over email for several months. Wow, Mike Lee, you're wrong. And outgoing Leesburg school board member Beth Bartz said the threats ultimately prompted her resignation. An LCPS spokesperson sent the Times-Mirror more than a dozen emails containing violent threats against members of the school board. No explicit threats. La-di-da-di-da. So it's just a ridiculous thing to say, and I really do hope someone was on hand to tell him that he was completely wrong, if not lying through his teeth right there at the hearing. And it becomes important that he's, I mean, we all know he's probably lying about stuff like this, but I'll get to it in a minute, at the end of the story. So they sent like more than a dozen, they forwarded more than a dozen that the LCPS had gotten a hold of. While the threats vary in tone and substance, more than one mentions board members being dragged from their homes and hung by a rope. That seems like an explicit death threat to me. Others direct violent and sexist language against school board chair Brenda Sheridan and vice chair Atusa Reeser, two of the women on the board. So, of course, in addition to the violence, there has to be some sexist language, of course. You can't just simply be upset with a board decision. That would be focusing on policy, which, of course, is what we said we were coming here to do. But our chief thrill in life is, in fact, threatening people. Anyway, but listen to Beth Bart's particular story here. The Thursday night before I resigned, a police car sat in front of my house with the lights on for hours, Bartz told the Times-Mirror on Wednesday, referencing her resignation announcement on October 15th. She recalled waking up at around 3 a.m. that morning and finding the officer gone, which is a little interesting. They assigned an officer to protect her house, and they hung around long enough to let her fall asleep thinking that she was protected through the night and then took off. I don't know whether that was by design, but one way of interpreting it, and the thing that came to mind for me was the police guards leaving the hospital in The Godfather, right? Like there's some arrangement here. And given, that we're just now sorting through the facts about some of the police officers during the Capitol riot being less than, less than officious in, and less than efficient in keeping rioters out and instead taking selfies with them or even actively helping them at some point. And people have wondered for a long time where the sympathies of certain police officers lie. And anyway, I mean, it very well could have been, we can't really spare you to stay there all night long, but stay there for long enough for her to feel comfortable and fall asleep and get a good night's sleep, and then, whatever. But that's not a great plan. But because here's how it plays out. She says, I realized, literally, there was nothing I could do to keep my family safe if someone wanted to follow through with their threats, Bartz said. I started writing my resignation letter at 3 a.m. Well, that's a pretty direct cause and effect, right? She wakes up, looks outside. Am I still safe? Are the police still here guarding me? No, they left in the middle of the night. And it suddenly occurred to me that they're gone. And who knows whether they told anybody that they were leaving on purpose. And somebody's on their way here now. She began writing her resignation letter right then at 3 a.m. She was obviously scared out of her mind. After conferring with friends and constituents in Leesburg later that morning, whom she said told her, no, it is time. You need to leave. Bartz posted her resignation announcement to social media around 1 p.m. One email that an LCPS spokesperson said was forwarded to the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office on Wednesday reads, and remember, Mike Lee said this didn't happen. Your kids will now be targeted, just like how you have targeted all our kids, which of course they haven't. But if you have no kids, just in case, it's actually kind of almost humorous if it wasn't so serious. Well, what if you have no kids? Well, if you have no kids, your relatives' kids will be targeted. Isn't that great? Like, we'll go to North Carolina where your brother-in-law's children live and kill them because of what you allegedly did here in Loudoun County. Seems reasonable. Like no parents of the kids that we're targeting are going to feel all mama bear about things and take out the shotgun and blow our heads off. That's not true. I mean, because we're right and they're wrong. And they know it down in North Carolina. I'm related to a person who's embroiled in controversy. My kids are sitting ducks. Anyway. But imagine getting this, right? Your kids will now be targeted just like how you have targeted all our kids. If you have no kids, your relatives' kids will be targeted. We have no choice but to arm ourselves, and here the syntax falls apart. We have no choice but to arm ourselves from the Stasi you have ordered to attack us. And they realized the generational problem here, and the paper explains helpfully that the Stasi was the state security service for Soviet East Germany between 1950 and 1990, in case you didn't know. And yeah, I guess what they meant, we have no choice but to arm ourselves against the Stasi you have ordered to attack us. What Stasi anybody has ordered to attack them, I have no idea. It could be that they're referring to the FBI and the DOJ memo saying that the FBI should look into the people who are leveling these threats. Now the Stasi, the secret police, are coming for us because, all I did was what any red-blooded American would do, threaten the lives of your relatives' children because of a school board decision. So, okay. It seems they may be going a bit overboard, but that's not enough. It's not enough that Mike Lee is just merely wrong. Just in case. Again, he does say, gosh, I'm really not sure. I haven't seen any explicit death threat. And he might have meant, well, that didn't use explicit language, not that it wasn't specific. I mean, I want something with expletives in it. So we have this one. Another message dated June 23rd, which would have been the day after the school board meeting that that one dad is dragged out of, the father of the victim of the first attack at Stonebridge High School, ends up getting dragged out after the June 22nd meeting. So on June 23rd, this one shows up, and we'll have to deal with, we'll see how we can do reading it on the radio. It contains several anti-Semitic and homophobic, I got a problem with this, homophobic slurs. I made the same slip yesterday as I was reading it at home. Very odd. Anyway, most of those not included in the excerpt here. The author writes that this is a very creative one. Not really. By which I mean, sometimes when you get threats from people like this, it's really amazing what they think packs the most power when they're trying to threaten you. Like, they get really weirdly specific, and there are certain words that seem to really resonate with them that makes you think, I don't know about this person's vocabulary. It's just very weird. So here we go. The author writes, hope someone pours a gallon of gasoline down your diseased sodomite anus. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. I hope you're having a nice breakfast. Hope someone pours a gallon of gasoline down your diseased sodomite anus and burns you in the street like the piece of utterly worthless, child-molesting dog ass that you are. So I'm not sure how this person is feeling exactly about the policy. It's a little unclear, but it does feel like maybe Mike Lee is a total effing a-hole liar. Just possibly. And he should be ashamed of himself if that were at all a thing that was possible. I just don't think he feels that kind of shame. Anyway, the forwarded emails include referrals from Sheridan, Reeser, and the LCPS superintendent, Scott Ziegler, to the school district's director of safety and security, John Clark, for investigation. Sheridan wrote, please report this individual to LSCO, the sheriff's office, and hire as appropriate, when she forwarded the June 23rd message. The Loudoun County Sheriff's Office did not immediately return the request for comment on the threats. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland issued a memo on October 4th, directing the Federal Bureau of Investigation and U.S. Attorney's offices to meet with law enforcement leaders at the federal, state, and local, and tribal and territorial levels, to address harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school board members across the country. Threats against public servants are not only illegal, they run counter to our nation's core values, Garland wrote. Those who dedicate their time and energy to ensuring that our children receive a proper education in a safe environment deserve to be able to do their work without fear for their safety. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia and Virginia Attorney General's Office did not immediately respond to requests for comment. Newly appointed Loudoun School Board member for the Broad Run District, Andrew Hoyler, Hoyler, told the Times-Mirror on Wednesday that while he understands some parents' frustrations with the board, others are, quote, threatening to drag us out of our house into the streets and telling us that we need to hang ourselves and that they'll supply the rope. And I guess maybe Mike Lee says, well, they didn't explicitly threaten to kill them. They threatened to, if anything, to facilitate them killing themselves. So it's all okay. It's all good. What is going on, or what's going through these people's minds to say these things, he said. And Bart's, whose last day with the school board will be November 2nd, maybe that's why it hasn't alleviated her problems, said she has no regrets about her service, but added that she will never run for public office again, which of course is the terrorists win, but, I can't tell her to do this. I can't blame her. It has been quite a journey, and I have no regrets, she said. Clearly she does. I have received a tremendous amount of support from the community, she said. After announcing her resignation, Bart said Leesburg residents have sent flowers and greeting cards in recent days. The bombs have slowed down, I guess. At the same time, I will never put my family in a situation where I have to choose between being an elected official and worrying about their safety, Bart said. Never again. And I'm sorry that that's the end of the article, because it's the whole effing point, really, of the article, or should have been the whole point of the article, that this is what they're basically doing. I lost the election. We didn't win with the people we wanted, so let's threaten to kill the people who did win so that they quit and we can replace them. We'll get another shot at replacing them with the people we wanted to have. Anyway, back to Mike Lee. I just kind of wanted to point out, one, that he was obviously, at least at minimum, woefully underinformed about what's actually going on out there. And I think you should put side by side his insistence that there's no explicit threats out there, along with the quotes from these letters, as I did on Twitter. And I'll point out, what do you think would happen, right? If someone were to send Mike Lee emails or letters with the text lifted verbatim from the letters I just read you, what would he be doing in that? Mike Lee would call the FBI and say that these people have to be visited. Of course, he should be ashamed of himself, but that's not likely to happen. On top of all that, remember why these parents are mad. They're mad because Scott Ziegler, the superintendent, denied that these things happened, which actually had happened. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I just want to finally, reiterate that point, that it occurs to me that maybe this is even the worst part of it, right? So Mike Lee is sitting there saying there are no threats. We should not be using the FBI to look into this, or not even to look into it or crack down on it. But remember, all they're being asked to do is meet with local officials and try to help them figure out how to deal with it. But none of this is happening, according to Mike Lee, which is amazing because all the parents who are up in arms about things here in Loudoun and want the school superintendent to resign and all the board members to resign, and then they, of course, want to hang them and pour gasoline somehow down their diseased whatever, something anuses. I think we would think that it would be up, but maybe you're hanging upside down in this scenario. I'm not really sure. Anyway, all of these people want these things to happen because they claim that what incensed them was what incensed the father of the victim here, that he went to a school board meeting and watched people ask questions about whether or not this stuff had actually happened, and in their view, the superintendent denied that these things had happened. And having taken a look back, I'm looking for a videotape of the exchange here, because there's one part of his comment that I thought was defensible in light of what we learned in court on Monday, was it? We maybe learned it finally on Tuesday, or we spoke about it on Tuesday, that the transgender element of this whole thing really has been portrayed wrongly, as the most mild way I could put it, and that the policy certainly couldn't have had anything to do with the first attack. But on top of that, it doesn't fit the pattern that they were hoping people would mistake this attack for. That is the nightmare or fever dream, depending on how you look at it, of somebody using the policy to position themselves in the bathroom and attack strangers as they enter. And that wasn't what was happening, but they wanted everybody to think that was what was happening, because that's the nightmare that they've planted in the minds of parents all around the country, and they thought that that had finally gotten an example of this actually happening. So they triggered that feeling in everybody, only to have us find out later that really isn't what happened. I mean, it may still be a nightmare for you. It might even still be in your mind something that could really happen, but it didn't, and you shouldn't pretend that it did in order to score these political points. Anyway, but the father of the victim here said that he was outraged, and other people joined him in the outrage when the superintendent said, well, this idea of the transgender student lying in wait to attack people at random just didn't happen. And it didn't. And he was right. There are other comments, though, that are still really kind of inexplicable. I mean, there's been an explanation offered, but they've even backed off of that. But that basically he was asked at the June 22nd meeting, at first by Beth Bartz, by the way, whether there was any, well, have there been any attacks in the bathrooms in the schools? And he said, we're not aware of there having been any attacks in the school bathrooms. And then an email surfaced from the date of the attack, May 28th, in which the superintendent's office lets the school board members know that there had been an attack at one of the schools, but it's not at all clear how much detail there was. And it's not entirely clear whether they were all informed that the attack took place in a bathroom, because that probably wasn't among the most important details that they were sharing. And of course, they were limited in what they could share because it was a juvenile case. So it is possible that there wasn't a great deal of detail involved. And the superintendent's explanation has been that he thought he was being asked that question in the context of this idea, this pervasive idea that there had been a transgender predator element to this, and that's what they were asking about. And he feels that the context made it less than clear, but still, it seems like he could have clarified that pretty quickly or asked a question in return. But anyway, it's interesting too that regardless of the fact that the case is basically first being pressed by school board members, and in particular Beth Bartz is under threat anyway, right? She gets this email. She asks the superintendent, "What's the deal with this? Is there people are talking about there having been an attack in a bathroom. Was there an attack in the bathroom? Like, why isn't that person your hero at that point?" But I guess the answer lies in the superintendent giving the answer that he did. And when people said, no, that's wrong, that's controversial, or at least, if not misleading, he explains himself. And I guess Beth Bartz at some point says in one of the articles I read, well, I accept his explanation for it. I see that it could have been confusing. Not an endorsement of the answer, but an acknowledgement of, all right, I see it could have been confusing to you, and I don't particularly think you were going out of your way to cover anything up, because, of course, you did notify us of it, and enough that we were able to ask questions about it at that meeting, even if the answers weren't good ones and might even have been misleading ones. But back to where I left off with Mike Lee, right? So the outrage here is supposedly is, we knew about these attacks, and you gave misleading answers and denied that these attacks had happened. That's the breach of trust for which you are supposed to resign. That's the breach of trust for which we are incensed enough to send you death threats and say that we're going to drag you into the street and hang you. fast forward to the Senate Judiciary hearing with Merrick Garland, who comes to defend the memo asking federal law enforcement agencies to help local law enforcement agencies deal with these threats that are actually happening that we have personal knowledge of, right? And now if we're sitting in the meeting in the audience watching this and somebody says, some official gets up and says, these threats were never made. This didn't happen. I deny the whole thing. Well, by the logic of the right wing in this situation, we should rise up, get ourselves dragged out of the meeting and possibly arrested, and start emailing Mike Lee that he should be dragged out of his house and hung in the street, or rather that we would give him rope and he could opt to hang himself. It's an opt-in program of murder that we have going on here. And that somebody should pour a gallon of gasoline, blah, 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 yada, yada, with Mike Lee. But no, of course not. Nobody's ever entitled to that. Republicans are entitled to it. And who can blame them? Their parents, their mama bears, papa bears, protecting their cubs, etc., etc. But when the tables get turned, suddenly the FBI needs to be involved. I remember also seeing a comment the other day. Tom Cotton, of course, very active in very vocal in this hearing as well. And somebody pointing out, of course, he's taking the Republican position. We shouldn't have the FBI and the secret police cracking down on people's First Amendment rights. This was the guy who said, use the army to suppress the Black Lives Matter protests. Call out the armed forces and start shooting people in the street. Now we have parents sending emails, maybe parents, who knows? They're probably not even parents, sending emails that they're going to burn people, drag them out of their house and strangle them, etc., and target the kids of their relatives, and on and on. Oh, come on. It's just First Amendment activity. This is an outrage. How dare the FBI get involved? Black people, army. White people, whatever. Never mind. Okay, I just thought I'd point that out. It's bothering me today. So Mike Lee is a liar and a hypocrite. Big deal, right? You knew that when you woke up. All right. Just thought I would share some of that stuff with you. Let me dive back into Pocket and the Twitter threads, etc., to see what else I've got on tap for you and see what other people are commenting on as well. Oh, look, one of the stories suggested by Rebecca Romans is also here in my in Pocket. So let's see. Should we? Whose piece are we going to read? She's sending me the one from the Hill. What do I have? I have MSNBC. I think I've got an earlier one, but I'm not sure. Maybe I didn't pocket it. Maybe I retweeted it the other day. It's not the hugest news in the world, but it's still pretty interesting. Let's see. Let me go with the MSNBC one here. Oh, no, you know what? That's a good follow-up one. I think that's got a little more analysis to it from Steve Bannon. We'll use the one that Rebecca sent us from The Hill, even though everybody hates The Hill. Whatever. I use their stuff, too. What do we got here? Richard Burr, Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina. Guess what? He's a bit of a liar and a jerk as well. And you know why. And you might even remember why. You may recall that he was one of the early COVID lockdown profiteers who was suspected of using insider information that he had gotten in Senate briefings to make stock trades first, and then maybe call some local officials about what to do about the impending doom from the global pandemic after that. Oh, yes. Now I remember what I put aside. There was an additional piece of information from Charlie Savage on this. Okay, here the basic outlines of the story are probably here in the Hill's piece. Richard Burr under insider trading investigation by SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is investigating whether Senator Richard Burr violated federal insider trading laws by selling more than $1.6 million in stocks before the market crashed last year. Why did it crash? COVID, that's why. In a court filing last week, first reported by ProPublica, good job, guys, the SEC revealed that it was probing Burr's decision to liquidate almost all of his stock holdings on February 13th, 2020, after receiving classified briefings about the emerging coronavirus pandemic. The agency is also investigating whether Gerald Fauth, F-A-U-T-H, Burr's brother-in-law made similar stock sales based on information he received from Burr in a phone call the same day. It seems highly likely, don't you think? By the way, yeah, if you're on the school board over here and you're a Democrat and you have relatives, we're going to kill their children. If you are a Republican senator and you have relatives, it's important that we call you and make you aware that you need to do your stock trading. I have a note here. This just in. This is legitimate paper right here and everything.
You're aware of that.
All right. Let's see. Just make sure I'm aware of what? Oh, yes, right. Oh, yeah, there was this element of it. And I think we made, well, I don't know if this made mention of this in our readings.
I think the issue behind the threats against her more so than the other.
Okay. So the threats to Beth Bartz, driven perhaps by another element of the story. Excuse me, Senator Burr, just hold on over there and don't do any insider trading while I'm reading this. The reason behind threats to Beth Bartz is more because of her involvement in a Facebook group of anti-racist parents of Loudoun County. The group is called Anti-Racist Parents of Loudoun County. And you don't want to get mixed up with people who aren't racist. Anyway, there was a whole lawsuit earlier this year to remove her from the board because the claim is that the group put together a list of parents in the county who opposed racial equity efforts and were targeting them in some way. So there was a lawsuit to just remove her from the board because she participated in a Facebook group that allegedly had this list of people they didn't like. And as you might imagine, the lawsuit was dismissed. But I guess that made her the enemy of the most active and vocal racist parents, or at least anti-racist parents in the county. So she's been targeted for a long time. That's true. That's definitely another element in all of this. Doesn't change the fact that she's been targeted and that's wrong, and that it was the threats that ultimately, she says, forced her to resign. But I guess that's the reason why they're not stopping now that you've given us what we want. What they want, of course, is to murder her, and she hasn't given them that yet. So I guess she's still under the gun, as it were, which tells you a little something about American culture, that's our idiom for it. Anyway, back to Richard Burr, whose relatives are perfectly safe and getting richer all the time because of his service in the Senate. Where did we leave off? Right. Gerald Fouth is his brother-in-law's name, and apparently he got the insider tips as well. Among other things, the commission is investigating whether Burr sold stocks on the basis of material non-public information, the agency revealed in a declaration filed in the district court for the Southern District of New York, where it is attempting to force Fouth to comply with a subpoena. I don't know. I guess he lives in New York. The SEC said it appears that Burr had non-public information gained through his position as chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, his membership on the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Remember that's abbreviated HELP. HELP, and his former staffers involved in pandemic response when he decided to sell almost all of his stock holdings. I mean, by the way, we've spoken before about like how to conceal your crimes in America, or how to conceal some of your, underhanded dealings in whatever way, right? We were talking last week, I guess, about straw donations, laundering foreign donations through somebody, and maybe if you were going to use a lobbyist for that, you wanted to hire John Smith or someone like that instead of, what was the guy's name? He had some outrageous and rather distinctive name that really set him apart as likely foreign, though he was an American, and just not a great way to avoid detection. Similarly here, if you're looking to fly under the SEC's radar, I mean, he's not a big stockholder, but it's $1.5 million. I mean, not a big stockholder like Elon Musk, trillions or whatever. But don't sell all of your stock holdings in one day and then think that the SEC, if you're a prominent citizen, isn't going to have some questions. I mean, it could all be totally legit when you do it. Not him. He's a liar. But you, for instance, listening to the show, you're an honest person. If you were to do it, well, if you had $1.6 million in stock, who knows what you would be doing with it. But say you did that anyway. It's, there are reasons, and then you get but you would be investigated, and you'd be able to prove that they were reasonable reasons, good reasons, legal reasons. If you're going to rely on insider information, don't sell everything you got. That's just not wise. Or at least establish a paper trail for getting the information elsewhere. I shouldn't be telling you how to commit these crimes, but just don't commit crimes, and don't do that, and then we're good. Burr allegedly called his stockbroker on the morning of February 13th, and that's probably why we're talking about doing this in the Southern District of New York. That's probably where the stockbroker is. Burr allegedly called his stockbroker on the morning of February 13th and instructed the broker to sell more than $1.6 million in equities he held in his and his wife's joint individual retirement account, their IRA. Interesting. According to the SEC, Fouth called his sister, Burr's wife, 2 hours later, and the senator called Fouth briefly soon after, the SEC alleged. I'm not too clear about why this goes around in a loop, but 3 minutes later, Fouth called his stockbroker and told the broker to sell several stocks in his wife's IRA, the SEC alleged. Federal law bans investors from buying or selling securities based on non-public information likely to affect the price of the asset once it becomes broadly known. Trading based on non-public information or insider trading often allows an investor to avoid major losses or reap major gains. The Stock Act, I forget what it stands for, but it's an acronym, the STOCK, Stock Act, also bans members of Congress from using information gained through their office to enrich themselves in financial markets. Burr's decision to nearly liquidate his stock holdings likely saved him and his wife hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential losses, which, by the way, they would mostly have bounced back from by now, so it was all a waste. But I guess if you think the world is ending and you want to be buried in money or use that as your funeral pyre or something, I guess that's the thing to do. But he's not a great investor, that seems clear. The market began crashing roughly 2 weeks after Burr's sale as the coronavirus outbreak reached pandemic levels, but has since soared well above its pre-pandemic heights. That's a little dig there at Burr. Duh. You should just sit tight. The Justice Department also investigated Burr's stock sales, but declined to press charges. Why? Because remember, this was Donald J. Trump's Justice Department that investigated it. Don't know what the current Justice Department thinks about it, but maybe the same thing. Burr, who will retire after his term ends in 2022, defended his stock sales in March of 2020 after ProPublica first reported on the disclosure. The senator told the Senate Ethics Committee that he based his decision on CNBC coverage of COVID-19's early impact in Asia. Sure. A Senate spokesperson for Burr did not respond to a Wednesday request for comment. All right. So I mentioned that there were some other writing on this subject, and let me share it with you. I happened to put aside the tweet from Charlie Savage, the New York Times reporter, who had a very interesting angle on it, that it was what the investigation had uncovered was a demonstration of the power of knowing people's communications metadata, which is not covered by the Fourth Amendment's privacy protections, according to a 1979 Supreme Court ruling. Charlie Savage, of course, intimately bound up in the coverage for many years of the monitoring of metadata since the first George W. Bush administration, as a matter of fact, when it broke just before, or just after, rather, I should say, rather famously, just after his first re-election campaign in December of 2004, when it became plain that the administration had been monitoring various communications metadata without any sort of warrant for it, and that perhaps some of it might even have been permissible under the 1979 Supreme Court ruling, but others they were seemingly bending the rules for. But everyone remembers that, and everyone, by the way, remembers the New York Times' decision, having found that out prior to the election, deciding to hold that information for after the election because they didn't want to impact the outcome of the election, because that's what newspapers do. They have nothing to do with elections whatsoever. And people were rather outraged and scandalized by that. Charlie Savage been covering that for 20 years or so. And so, I don't know, still top of mind for him. Good point. Basically, what's happening here is he's using one of the tweets from, well, whose tweet is this? Robert Fattorici. Fattorici, is that how you might say his name? I don't know. Hopefully I haven't mangled it too bad. He's an investigative reporter with ProPublica involved in putting that story together. He was tweeting it this way. Breaking, SEC says Senator Richard Burr had material non-public info rate COVID economic impact. After Burr dumped stock, he called his brother-in-law. And then his brother-in-law called his stockbroker the next minute. Quote, the next minute. Good point there. What makes the case here is the easy access to the metadata that tells us the amount of time that passes in between Burr calling you and you calling your stockbroker. And that's pretty good circumstantial evidence making the case against you. Good point about metadata. Thanks, Charlie. I mentioned an MSNBC article on this, and I held it because Steve Bannon was tweeting about it this morning, and he's usually got an interesting angle on these things. Senate Republican faces SEC probe over controversial stock trades. Senator Burr already investigated by the Justice Department, now drawing scrutiny by the SEC. And, yeah, I mean, the basic facts of the story, obviously, are going to be laid out in pretty much the same way. Maybe what was more interesting in terms of... he repeats the questions here. One of the things that was most interesting about Steve Bannon's discussion of it was the comments he made in the tweet accompanying the article. And it looks like he's repeated them down here. Burr has denied any wrongdoing, though there are a handful of lingering questions in need of answers. These are good ones. First, was it really an amazing coincidence that the then chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee and his brother-in-law sold off investments shortly before a market crash? Why did Trump's Justice Department, or on the Republicans, that is Trump's, last day in office, conclude that the Republican senator shouldn't be charged? Again, a bit of a timing issue here for us, right? What's going on that the Trump Justice Department on January 20th, I guess, maybe on the 19th, it says, by the way, conclusion of the Justice Department, no particular reason we're issuing this today. Don't charge Burr. And by the way, does the new Justice Department feel differently? If Burr is forced to resign before the end of his term, no one will ever force that on him, I'm sure. What will happen to his seat? That is always a good question. I don't know if we're going to get any answer here, but I don't know. Whatever normally happens in such a situation. Just putting it out there, though. All right. I thought that was an interesting angle on things, too. Let's see. Other things that I have pocketed and interested in sharing with you. Oh, well, a couple of smaller bits here and there. Just I saw that this tweet this morning that's an interesting factoid that I thought I would share. The larger article attached to it doesn't seem to be primarily focused on this, but Lena Sun, health reporter for the Washington Post, picking out of the article about military vaccine mandates. What's the title of the article here? Air Force is the first to face troops' rejection of vaccine mandate as thousands avoid shots. That's a story in and of itself, but the part picked up on by Lena Sun that was interesting, I never would have guessed this. More military personnel died in the month of September, just this past September, of coronavirus infections than in all of 2020. That's interesting. Also pointing out that none of those who died were fully vaccinated. That won't surprise anybody. But the first fact does. For whatever reason, September 2021, the deadliest month for military personnel due to COVID, and in fact so deadly that it was more people dying of COVID in September of 2021 than in the entirety of calendar year 2020, which does seem weird and does raise some interesting questions. I am a little curious about how the military avoided major losses from COVID, given that, active duty military living on base and deployed elsewhere are in such close proximity. It seems like really a terrible place to have to enforce COVID protocols and mitigation strategies. But maybe they were either extraordinarily successful in being able to do that because, active duty military, you give people orders, put these masks on, they do it. I guess for whatever reason they draw the line at the vaccination, but I think that's, largely due to right-wing garbage that they read online. And only a small percentage will be resisting the vaccine in the end, I'm sure. Even if it is thousands, it will be a small percentage. And then I looked at the article, too, just to say, by the way, so how many people was it in September of 2021 who died? And it isn't a huge number. I mean, the military, of course, there's lots and lots of people in there, but I had to scroll all the way down to try to find it. 71 coronavirus-related fatalities in the ranks to date. So that's not a whole lot. They've actually been quite a success story, I think, the military population, in avoiding serious disease. And who knows what it has to do with. I'm sure there's a lot of factors, including, generally speaking, you're talking about relatively healthy people, active duty military, especially among the enlisted ranks, where physical training is a big part of what you're doing. And, maybe also the isolation of the enlisted active duty ranks from the rest of the general population. You are crowded together in ways on base, but you're also isolated on base and not all that often in general circulation with the population who's doing all the coughing and the spreading. But I don't know. I'm just guessing. But it would be an interesting study nonetheless. All right, we'll be back for the second hour with more tidbits and larger pieces after this. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So let's see, other things that I wanted to share with you from the past couple of days that haven't made it into the show. Yesterday, I think, we read through Amanda Marcotte's piece in Salon on her reflections on the situation in Loudoun County and her recollection that it bore some resemblance to the satanic panics of the late 80s and 90s. There's another similar viewpoint expressed here in, what am I looking at? In Free Thoughts blogs here. Let's see, whose stuff am I reading? If I follow the, where's the byline on this? I don't know why it's not as obvious as it ought to be. P.Z. Myers, the author here, just taking a slightly different view of things, saying that it's creationism all over again. And I don't know whether the point is exactly the same here as what I was thinking, but it's certainly about what's going on here. It wasn't that long ago, the piece begins, and it's still ongoing, that creationists followed a relatively successful strategy of packing school boards with loons. School boards are not popular career destinations. It's relatively easy for a fanatic to run for the board, and often they get strong support from local churches. And it also helps if you threaten the lives of the people who are already on the board so that they resign, so that you can then run with your energized base of would-be murderers and win that seat. Now, take a look at this. The same strategy is being followed by anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, and anti-CRT kooks. It is illustrated with one of the Ron Filipkowski tweets. This one reads, Jimmy Kimmel put together a compilation of some of my school board clips last night. Sorry, but I don't want any of these people to have any input on what my kids are taught in school. One of the interesting observations underlying what people were saying was a gaffe by Terry McAuliffe. But yeah, truly, there are some parents that really shouldn't have any input on educational policy. Anyway, there's a video clip with it, watch it on your own. It'd be a lot easier to do that than to deal with the copyright infringement of my playing it now. I wonder how long it is. Just a minute and 34. So we definitely can't fit it all in there. But the segment, a play on Town Hall called Clown Hall. So starts off with a joke. So you might be entertained. Anyway, just a short little piece here from P.Z. Myers saying, we need more reasonable, serious people to run for school board positions, so do consider it yourself. I doubt anybody will be considering it after finding out what happened, of course, to the school board members here in Loudoun, or probably in your local area either. That's one of the problems with it. But that's also part of the strategy for it. How could somebody so outrageously stupid and kooky be in a position to win a seat like that when the whole town full of normal people knows that they're a kook and an idiot and don't belong anywhere near the school board? It gets a lot easier if no one will dare to run against the kook and idiot, because the kook and idiot is threatening to murder everybody, and everybody is cowering at home, or bravely standing outside with a shotgun if you prefer to do things that way, and not running for school board. I mean, that helps clear the field, or at the very least lowers very often the quality of candidate you will draw in opposition. Anyway, unfortunately, you probably should be considering doing it yourself, but no one will want to. The piece here continues, the blog post. It's not a long article. When I first moved to Morris, I don't know where, but Morris, I offered to run, and I got nothing but looks of horror from local DFL people. Well, there's the answer. That means Minnesota, right? I guess I'm not the kind of guy to be popular with the church crowd that is likely to turn out for a school board election, so they were probably right to look for more congenial candidates. If you can't run, the next best thing is to vote in these elections. The school board elections are far more important than most people assume. That's true. What I took away from It's Creationism All Over Again was, in the headline, I had read it just after, or just at the same time as seeing Amanda Marcotte's piece. And so I guess, the point being made in the post isn't quite the same as I took out of it. But where she was saying it's satanic panic all over again, right? I was just thinking of the way people crowded school board meetings over creationism and the teaching of evolution, and in recent history, not just way back when, but you remember when people were flooding the school boards with intelligent design arguments and that you should teach the controversy, right? Teach the controversy. And it struck me that, this piece talks more about anti-mask, anti-vax, and anti-CRT, which is occupying the time in the school boards in most places around the country. They're not having the same problems that we're having in Loudoun, but eventually you all will, so think about that. But it occurred to me, of course, that, that, and in conjunction with the story from the Texas school boards the other day about, if you're going to teach about the Holocaust, you got to have a differing opinion, an alternative opinion about the Holocaust, and that there are certain things for which the Gimmitarian, this is what explains it. The Gimmitarian philosophy is, you got to teach the controversy. That is to say, what's really ought to be taught in schools is science, and science has led us to the theory of evolution, and you should teach that. Well, no, but we should also have the opposing viewpoint of creationism. Well, no, that's not science. You can teach that in a theology class if you have time for it, but in science, we'll teach science. No. You should at least mention it. Say that there's controversy. Teach the controversy, right? Now, of course, if you're like, gee whiz, I really think that there's maybe such a thing as systemic racism and we ought to talk about its effects on this country, that controversy we don't get to teach. That's very interesting. That controversy is banned. Ban that controversy. Teach my controversy. Well, that doesn't seem to make any sense. Well, if you don't like it, I'll come back to the other side again, and then I'll show you how fair I am. I argue both sides. You're going to teach about the Holocaust? Teach the controversy. Teach that there are people who say it didn't happen and that it was all a hoax. Okay, but then can we revisit the controversy I wanted to teach? No. Why not? Because gimmitarianism. I want it this way. I want this taught, I want this taught, and I don't want that taught. Can you come up with a coherent policy that would land on that outcome? Teaching this, not teaching that? Yes, gimmitarianism. Teach what I say. Listen to the parents. Let the parents decide. Well, that's what underlies all of this. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting addition and a good reminder that, people have been screaming at school boards for quite a while now, and it's usually about something they want personally. It's gimmitarianism, and everybody should bend to my will. All right. That, I thought, an interesting bit. That may lead us over to, I'm cleaning out in Pocket here today. And did I grab this one already? I think I mentioned that I had it in Pocket, but I didn't get to it. But I mentioned that Michael Harriot had a interesting thread that I grabbed, and that's a name you'll recognize. I think I mentioned it when I mentioned that I had it. Darwin's read us a number of his things. And anyway, I happened to see this one being passed around with some comments pointing out that it was a good and thoughtful thread. And I'll grab it since we were just talking about angry parents yelling about things, including critical race theory. He starts out this way. Okay, let's not call it critical race theory. We won't even call it black history. Instead, let's accept the premise they propose. So, how does American history look if K through 12 social studies and history teachers don't teach kids about racism and white supremacy? Here comes the thread. And I guess this would be his idea of how lessons would have to look. And think about how crazy it is. And he does a great job illustrating it. In 1607, 104 Englishmen arrive in North America and almost starve to death. Why did they come here? Well, we can't let kids read the Jamestown Charter because they might see the actual words describing the natives who already had a government and a religion here as people who, this is the actual words of the Jamestown Charter, whose ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God and may in time bring the infidels, there's more to it now that I've opened the picture. The people who live in darkness and miserable ignorance, of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring the infidels and savages living in these parts to human civility and to a settled and quiet government. So, anyway, obviously you can't let kids know about that, right? You can't teach them about that because reasons. In 1619, some more people arrived. They weren't quite indentured servants, and they weren't free. I'm not sure exactly what they were. What was the difference? Well, if I showed you the actual laws, you might start to believe that America started out as a racist country, so we can't do that, obviously. Which are those laws that he's talking about? A statute of 1662 in Virginia. Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of their mother. That is the condition of slavery inherited through the mother. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman, the ones they're raping, should be a slave or free. Be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of their mother. That would, of course, be the color of the skin of their mother. And that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro woman or man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. And they didn't ever really get around to collecting any of that fines or anything, but just pointing that out. And, so it's a bit of a weird thing, right? But why would you examine what the actual laws were at the time? That's just history, right? So you don't need that in our history class. What you need to know is that America is awesome. Why? Because the rule of law. What laws? Just laws and they rule. They totally rule, man. So and goodbye, everybody. That's the end of history. In 1776, America declared its independence from Britain. Then there was a Revolutionary War. And then they created a constitutional oligarchy that allowed 25% of the population to vote. But we're going to call it a democracy because words don't mean things. And, of course, obviously, illustrating all of that with the founding documents and then the definitions of the words they were using. He also goes on to say, we cannot discuss the legislative branch or Article 1 of the Constitution because if we did that, we'd have to talk about race. So don't read it. We're going to tell people, don't read this part of the Constitution. It says right here that the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed upon such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person, even though we don't think they're persons. And yada yada. We're going to yada yada that in the 3/5 thing as well. Just don't read that part of the Constitution. Sure, it's our founding document, but it might tip you off to racism, and we can't have that. So I guess we edit the Constitution in order to make it fit under critical race theory bans. We cannot discuss Article 2 either because we would have to talk about the Electoral College, which means we'd have to talk about race in the 3/5. We cannot talk about Article 4 either. Which people forget about. We can't talk about Article 5 because we repealed it. That's an inside joke. We cannot talk about America's founding document because we cannot talk about race. America's not a racist country. So that's it. Learning about the Constitution is out the window too. But I got to tell you, not a major loss because I think learning about the Constitution has been out the window for a long time. We can talk about the founding fathers, but not the children some of them fathered. We can talk about what they did, but we can't talk about how they earned their money. We can't talk about the U.S. economy or how entire portions of the country became so wealthy. They just were. The end. I guess that's all there is to it. We can't talk about why entire nations of natives moved across the country. Right? Well, when they got here, wasn't there anybody here? Sure, there was a native Indian population. Where did they go? Places. Death being one of them, but the other, we have entire nations just setting out on foot, being driven across the country under the gun, once again. And, that happened. We don't know why. They just chose to move. They wanted to relocate, Look, how it is. Location, location, location. Can't talk about why entire nations of natives moved across the country. We can't talk about most of the treaties signed by the government. We can't talk about 17% of the legislative output of Congress during those years. We can't talk about economics. Can't talk about geography or expansion. In 1861, now that there's so much we can't talk about, we can do history in one day here. In 1861, 11 states in the richest country in the world decided they would rather form their own country. No one knows why. I could say it was about states' rights, but some might reply, the right to do what? So if we get there, then we can't talk about it, so I might as well not even mention the bloodiest war in American history. But after that war, on December 6th, 1865, the U.S. ratified the 13th Amendment. We can't say what it did, but we can say that the U.S. population exploded by 4 million people who were already living in the country and working here for the absolute most minimum wage imaginable, right? The absolute minimum wage. So all of a sudden, we had a big war. More people died in this war than in any other war in United States history. Despite that, when it was over, we had 4 million more people than we did before. Where did they come from? Nowhere. They were already here. Wow, I don't get it. That's mathematically impossible. Well, I guess we're going to have to ban math now because can't tell you. Critical race theory. Sorry. Then came the period called Reconstruction. We can't say what we were reconstructing from. All I can say is there was a lot of terrorism and secret fraternities that changed the political, social, and economic structure of America, but I can't say why. Next up, World War I, then the Great Depression, when the American economy collapsed. The country fixed it with the New Deal, the greatest social program in American history. It created what we now call the middle class, but of course only for some people. Can't say who. Then came World War II, and a lot of people joined the army. Some joined to fight for freedom, others joined for financial stability offered by the GI Bill. Some of the war veterans did not get the freedom or the financial stability. Can't say who. But never mind, America's not a racist country, so we don't say such things. Then came the Civil Rights Movement. Don't know what that was about. Martin Luther King said something about little girls and little boys, and some people did not like him. Can't say who. If we don't talk about race, obviously, not only can't we understand American history, but if we don't understand the complex problem of race in America, one can only surmise that current disparities exist because some people are lazier and dumber and more violent than others. I can't say who, but by the way, a lot of people will probably be very pleased with that outcome and to teach that. And they do teach that at home. This version will also mean people will think they know history because they got good grades in social studies, but they will have no idea that they're really ignorant to the truth. And here's the crazy part. This is actually how history is currently taught, for the most part. Social studies is the only subject in the American educational system that damn near everyone is taught wrong. When you took advanced math in college, you didn't learn that 2 + 2 = 8. Your English professor didn't have to explain that question marks didn't exist. But in America, you have to actually unlearn lies to understand history. And if you think you weren't lied to, ask yourself this. Why do you know Christopher Columbus's name? Seriously, forget about whether he was good or bad. Why does every child in America know his name? Because they told us a lie that he discovered America. We know it's objectively false, but still kids still know his name. But that's not what we're doing right now. I'm accepting your premise. So let's say CRT actually taught that all white people are privileged and America is racist. Now, think about the extermination of the indigenous people, or the violent theft of their land, or black people's labor, or Reconstruction, or Red Summer, or the Civil Rights Movement, or all the economic disparities, social inequality, and political barriers that still exist. If you use legislation to create a system that protects all white kids from simply having to learn the history that black and indigenous people actually endured, then aren't you proving that critical race theory was correct this whole time? Yes. And that's actually the end of the thread. But I thought, good point. But, it is interesting to try to imagine what would, even if we said, okay, will you take yes for an answer this time, and we'll declare you the winner, and you can have nothing that meets your fluid and evolving definition of critical race theory can be taught in American schools. What's left? If you can't even approach any of these subjects, what do you end up telling people the Civil War was about? And I guess the real answer is the real answer. You say it's about states' rights, and that's that. No one knows exactly what that's supposed to mean. But definitely not slavery. Totally wasn't that. Okay, sure. All right, well, let's jump around a little bit more. We'll switch subjects a little bit and catch up on some things that we haven't heard in the last couple of days. Remember Lev Parnas? Yeah, you do, right? A guy who started out originally as a Rudy Giuliani partner, both in business and in his political subterfuge and his efforts in Ukraine. We mentioned probably a couple of weeks ago, that he was getting ready to go on trial, that his trial date was finally starting, but not for anything having to do with Giuliani and the Ukraine and the political angle of going on there, but the various financial crimes with which he was charged, and we heard about originally when we first were introduced to Lev Parnas. So the trial was, last week, and I guess they're done now, and I thought I would update you on that in general. but also bring you this piece from The Bulwark, which I don't usually go to, but is a frequent source for Greg. Kimberly Wheely, W-E-H-L-E. So, best guess at the pronunciation, but I can pronounce Lev Parnas. Lev Parnas is a reminder and warning of Trump's sleazy corruption, and I'm up for any reminder of Trump's sleazy corruption. The Ukrainian-American businessman convicted last week, there's your answer, of campaign finance violations, was in the background of Trump's first impeachment. Just thought I'd update you on what happened to him and how his trial went, and remind you of just how sleazy Trump's world is. Buried in last week's news was the conviction by a Manhattan jury of Lev Parnas for arranging over $350,000 in illegal campaign contributions to two pro-Trump super PACs and a Republican member of Congress in 2018. This, of course, a hot topic these days because we were talking just the other day and reminded ourselves earlier in the show of the story of the money laundering that's been going on, or that's been being uncovered of late, and the straw purchases, or not straw purchases, but the straw donations and the like that we were talking about earlier, referencing obliquely in part of our other story. But yeah, several of them, right? The one laundering of, I forget which one was in fact the sting. Was it the Chinese businessmen? But then also the Russian oligarchs laundering their money into the race. And the former Mitch McConnell operative involved in that operation. Anyway, so yes, Lev Parnas, same thing, was curiously involved in the same crime, the same activity, same time, and from many of the same sources and to many of the same recipients, laundering $350,000 into Republican coffers. Parnas is a Ukrainian national, well, originally, he's an American now, who, according to former House Intelligence Committee counsel Daniel Goldman, resided in the underbelly of the Ukraine story that gave rise to Donald Trump's first impeachment, and who operated as Rudy Giuliani's liaison to a lot of the significant officials in Ukraine. Giuliani, you recall, was in 2018 and 19 acting as Trump's personal lawyer, or really more of a fixer. That's what Trump's view of lawyers is, with an eye on the 2020 presidential race and the expectation that Joe Biden would be a serious rival to Trump. Giuliani sought to persuade Ukrainian officials in 2019 to open a criminal investigation into Biden and his son, Hunter Biden. The events culminated in Trump's infamous July 2019 quid pro quo phone call with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Compared to some of the intervening political crises, Trump's pressuring Ukraine to announce a criminal investigation into Biden seems almost quaint. But less than 2 years ago, it led to his first impeachment on abuse of power charges. Today, Trump seems more emboldened than ever to secure power, dangling the possibility of another presidential run in front of the slavering, sycophantic Republican Party. Parnas, however, faces prison time. It is worth taking a moment to revisit the basis of the charges against Parnas, which did not arise from his dealings with Giuliani, as a reminder of the kinds of corruption that surround Trump. Federal law bans foreign donations to campaigns, and also requires public reporting to the Federal Election Commission of contributions and expenditures made in connection with federal elections. The Department of Justice indicted Parnas and 3 co-conspirators, Igor Fruman, David Correa, remember we haven't heard his name in a while, and Andrei Kukushkin, for allegedly having made false statements to the FEC, falsified records, conspired to defraud the United States by using a phony corporation to make campaign donations, and by wiring hundreds of thousands of foreign-sourced dollars through a bank account under Fruman's control. Remember all of that? The straw company was called Global Energy Producers, a purported liquefied natural gas import-export business that Parnas incorporated with Fruman around the time of their illegal campaign contributions on behalf of a Russian financier who sought political influence to further his business interests in the U.S. marijuana industry. Remember all of this? Correa, who also has business ties to Giuliani, pleaded guilty in October of 2020. Last month, Fruman pleaded guilty to soliciting donations from a foreign national, but made no agreement to testify against the others as part of his plea deal. We'll update you on what happened with Lev next. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue with our update on what happened in the Lev Parnas trial. Found guilty. That's the end of the update. But here's the background. As we mentioned, this had to do with the laundering of foreign donations into Republican coffers for Trump's super PACs and for at least one Republican member of Congress or candidate for Congress. Right, and Correa had pleaded guilty in October of 2020. Fruman also pleaded guilty. And Parnas and Kukushkin pleaded not guilty to all the charges. And on Friday, it didn't work out for them. They were convicted at trial. In January of 2020, Parnas told MSNBC's Rachel Maddow, and remember that he sort of tried to turn himself into hey, I've woken up and realized just what a jackass Trump really is, and maybe I can save my skin by flipping on him kind of figure. In January of 2020, Parnas told MSNBC's Rachel Maddow that Trump, quote, knew exactly what was going on, unquote, with Giuliani in Ukraine, and that former Vice President Mike Pence and Attorney General William Barr were also, quote, in the loop. In July of this year, new audio was leaked of a 2019 phone call between Giuliani, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine Kurt Volker, and Andrei Yermak, a senior advisor to Zelensky. In the 45-minute recording, Giuliani is captured saying, all we need from the president, that would be Zelensky, is to say, I'm going to put an honest prosecutor in charge. He's going to investigate and dig up the evidence that presently exists, and is there any other evidence about involvement of the 2016 election, and then the Biden thing has to be run out. I'm sure this made sense to the people listening in some way that it doesn't to us. It should go without saying that it's bad for the American system of government if a sitting president can use his unparalleled national security, law enforcement, financial, and diplomatic power to strong-arm his way into more time in office. Yet, that's precisely what Donald Trump tried to do twice, and, well, every day of his life, and thus far there has been zero accountability for it. He was impeached, but Senate Republicans blocked his conviction. Far from distancing itself from him because of his Ukraine malversion, the GOP has stuck with Trump through the pandemic, through his attempt to steal the election, through the riot he incited at the Capitol, and through the first 10 months of his conspiracy theory spreading ex-presidency. Lest we forget, 11 other close associates were charged with crimes in connection with Donald Trump's presidency, including Steve Bannon, for fundraising fraud and now possibly criminal contempt of Congress, Tom Barrack, providing illegal intelligence to UAE officials, Elliot Broidy, conspiracy involving secret lobbying, Michael Cohen, illegal hush money payments on Trump's behalf. Michael Flynn, lying to the FBI. Rick Gates, concealing funds related to Ukraine lobbying work. Paul Manafort, conspiracy to obstruct justice. George Nader, sex crimes involving minors. George Papadopoulos, lying to investigators. Roger Stone, lying to Congress and threatening a witness. And Alan Weisselberg, tax crimes. Trump pardoned Manafort, Papadopoulos, and Stone. And, well, I mean, more than that, right? Flynn, too, didn't he? I don't know why Flynn gets left off of this list. And that's just the old crowd. A younger generation of Trump-supporting Republicans who have, for the last 5 years, seen Trump's lies and corruption without punishment as the norm is coming up behind them. This is the slate of villains, both familiar and new, who could be expected to populate a second Trump administration in 2025. In an interview for my YouTube show, Simple Politics, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a professor, I'm guessing at the pronunciation, Ben-Ghiat, very famous, but just never knew how to pronounce her name, a professor at New York University, author of the book Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, and expert in fascism, global autocracy, and propaganda, described a great sense of dread watching Trump on the campaign trail back in 2015. Although classic fascism is a one-party state with no opposition of any sort that uses a combination of propaganda and repression and corruption to rule, she explained, to think of Trump's initial entry into politics as fascism would be a mistake. Benito Mussolini led a democracy for 3 years and only slowly chipped away at it over time, said Ben-Ghiat. Today it's incremental. It's evolution and not revolution. What she saw very tragically in 4 years of Trump was a shift from a culture that supports the rule of law to a culture of corruption, a culture that supports violence, and a culture that supports lawlessness, basically. Because the essence of authoritarianism is getting away with things. Time and again, conservative elites have looked at figures like Trump and thought that they're going to dominate and control this outsider, this hothead. And instead, the opposite happens. Likewise, Trump got a hold of the GOP, and they were ready for a person like him, and he instituted a kind of an authoritarian-style party discipline. Ben-Ghiat mapped out the next stage of democracy's death, whereby authoritarians populate government with zealots, sycophants, and people who are going to do your bidding. The Nazis and the fascists used to hire criminals, she added, because they were more easy to corrupt. Then, once they're in power, the law becomes weaponized by these modern autocrats, and they use less overt mass violence and more use of regulatory codes, fiscal codes, tax codes. So they have armies of lawyers working for them, and that's how they get at their enemies. Parnas's case, the sleazy corruption and foreign influence in U.S. politics, is a reminder of what Trump's administration was. But it's also a harbinger of what a second Trump term might be if Democrats in Congress and Merrick Garland at the helm of DOJ don't avail themselves of every ounce of political and legal capital to save democracy. The clock is ticking. All right, well, sadly true, and a timely warning. Let's see. Perhaps because it's Friday and we have a little bit of time left, we might want to scroll down to that Lawfare article that I threatened you with last Friday and didn't get around to. Let's see. That's probably a good place to start. Let's throw that in there because it's a good play off of what they were speaking of in the Bulwark and the slow evolution of an authoritarian regime here in this country. But remember that the focus of the Lawfare article was on the claims of executive privilege with respect to the January 6th investigation and the January 6th committee, and this sort of technocratic view of it. Jonathan Schaub put this piece together. He contributing editor of Lawfare, but also assistant professor of law at the University of Kentucky, in case you were wondering. And This, of course, newly relevant both in because of Steve Bannon's continuing contempt of Congress and their attempt to decide exactly what to do about it. We'll also throw in there, by the way, this CNN report. At least I'll give you the headline here. January 6th committee is losing patience with Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, as it seeks his testimony. Remember, he was originally listed as engaging with the committee, not attempting to evade their subpoenas altogether, but engaging. But I guess all of that was a delaying game. We could read a little bit about what's going on here before we dive into the lawfare. Members of the House Select Committee investigating January 6th were losing patience with the pace of talks with former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, and some are considering whether more aggressive steps are needed to force his compliance in the sweeping probe, multiple sources tell CNN. Meadows was first subpoenaed more than a month ago, and since then the committee has indicated he's been, quote, engaging in negotiations over the terms of his turning over documents and appearing for a deposition. But weeks after the committee granted Meadows a short but indefinite postponement of the initial subpoena deadline, members are growing increasingly frustrated and contemplating when and how to ramp up the pressure. So you get the idea. He's just basically trying to drag this thing out. And he was happy to be listed as engaging with the committee and not engaging in contempt and not get himself charged. But he's still not done anything more to cooperate than Steve Bannon has. So anyway, meanwhile, by the way, another worrying headline from the other day, though it was in Politico. January 6th, investigators postpone push for some Trump records. And there was some legalistic reason for doing so. Some flag raised in the examination of the documents that some limited number of the pages that they were seeking might have a more legitimate claim to one of the recognized privileges. And but there you find the committee slowing down, trying to do everything by the book, and that's got to have some members frustrated with the pace of things as well. But let me jump back to lawfare and their, I think, interesting discussion of the dynamics of executive privilege. Because now, of course, Trump continues to insist that he's got the right to assert executive privilege and is now filing suit, suing the National Archives, suing the special committee itself, and claiming that their ideas about what they're entitled to are the wrong ones. So anyway, back to lawfare, executive privilege, and the January 6th investigation. For several weeks now, a constitutional conflict has been simmering on Capitol Hill. Congress is seeking access to information regarding the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and the Trump White House's efforts to subvert the results of the November 2020 election. Former President Trump has vowed repeatedly to fight those information requests, utilizing one of his favorite constitutional weapons while in office, executive privilege. And the Biden administration is in possession of that information. To what extent the former president can rely on executive privilege to prevent Congress from gaining access to information, a question that has rarely arisen and that has never been resolved, is now front and center. The House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack turned up the heat on the controversy on September 23rd, issuing subpoenas to 4 close confidants of Trump that demand testimony and personal documents about Trump's actions leading up to and on January 6th. Trump responded with a familiar pledge to fight the subpoenas on executive privilege and other grounds, not for his own sake, but for the good of our country. And soon thereafter, Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, suggested the Biden administration would comply fully with the information requests from the committee and that President Biden had already concluded that it would not be appropriate to assert executive privilege. Her statements led to reports that Biden would waive all available claims of privilege before the committee, but the White House later clarified that she was referring only to past cases and that future cases would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. The committee indicated on September 27th that a good number of additional subpoenas are forthcoming. The contours of the looming conflict are becoming clear. The committee intends to be aggressive and seek any and all information, notwithstanding any potential privilege issues, the Biden administration will pose few, if any, obstacles to the committee's information demands, and the Trump team will exhaust every avenue to fight the release of information. The various issues raised by the commission's subpoenas and other requests for information are complex and largely unanswered by the courts. Nor is it clear whether Trump and his team will ultimately follow through on his threats on what choices each individual subject to the committee's inquiry will make about his conflicting duties to the former president, the current president, and the congressional inquiry. As for the bottom line, it seems quite likely that the committee is correct that as a legal matter it is entitled to most of the information and testimony it seeks, but as a practical matter the committee may never receive it. 4 distinct groups, each with a unique set of legal obligations and authorities, are now caught up in the question whether the committee will receive the information and testimony it seeks. First, the committee itself, which is exercising Congress's constitutional power of inquiry, including the power to subpoena documents and testimony, to conduct its investigation. To date, everyone appears to agree that the committee's subpoenas are within that investigative authority. Questions remain, however, about whether any subpoena recipient has a valid defense to that authority, such as executive privilege, and perhaps more importantly, whether the committee has any mechanism for enforcing its authority if faced with recalcitrance. Okay. Now, by the way, I'll add to that, I don't know that it's the case that everyone appears to agree that the committee's subpoenas are within that investigative authority. I mean, it is, but there are some who say, well, you need to have a legitimate legislative reason for, what legislation are you aiming to pass that the availability of this information will make possible? That there needs to be a legislative purpose. And there really doesn't. That's just not the case. Perhaps in the main, for ordinary oversight, you might be able to make that claim, but it wouldn't stand because, Congress's powers in this are pretty much plenary. They can investigate anything that they want. And whether or not legislation results from it, legislation will be informed by it regardless, because you can hardly help that. It's the legislative branch. Anything they actually do is legislative in nature in the end, but there's no such constriction on them, which I guess is why he doesn't spend any time on it. And we shouldn't either. I shouldn't have said it. Second, the Biden administration includes the quasi-independent National Archives and Records Administration and other federal agencies, which together have control of the official government documents and correspondence responsive to the committee's requests. I'm now regretting saying that I shouldn't have brought it up. I'm glad I brought it up because it'll come up and the Trump team will bring it up and you need to be prepared for it. It's wrong, but you need to be prepared for it. So where were we with this one? The second, the Biden administration is the next player in this. 4 distinct groups, right? The Biden White House will determine whether to exercise the executive branch's constitutional authority to assert executive privilege and withhold information on whether to waive any potential privilege claim, and agency officials, many of whom are Biden appointees, will comb through records and, in coordination with the White House, determine what should be released to the committee. Third parties in this: Trump's legal team and advisors, who are no longer in control of any records and no longer have the legal authority to direct officials who formerly worked for Trump about the release of information. Trump will fight to assert his view of executive privilege, where it contradicts the Biden administration's view, also everybody else's, and will likely rely on both the courts and private influence to try and keep information from becoming public. He may also contest the committee's authority to receive information and testimony. And fourth, there are private individuals, including the 4 who were issued subpoenas on September 23rd. Some of these individuals were government officials at the time relevant to the committee's inquiry, and some were not. Bannon, right? Each of these private citizens will have to determine individually what his legal obligations are and decide which, if any, of the 3 previous groups has authority to direct or influence his actions, though he may find out that he was wrong about which ones he thought had authority. Here are the controversies. To date, there appear to be at least 3 areas in which a conflict related to executive privilege may arise. Though the contours of each conflict will vary, there are also looming legal battles over the committee's access to information that involves issues other than executive privilege, such as the committee's preservation order for records related to the activities of members of Congress. But those have distinct legal frameworks and must be analyzed separately. First, and most recently, the committee has subpoenaed testimony from 4 former Trump confidants: Mark Meadows, Steve Bannon, Dan Scavino, and Kash Patel. These subpoenas almost ensure some conflict will occur, and Trump quickly released a statement in response saying he would fight the subpoenas on executive privilege and other grounds. Meadows and Scavino were White House officials during the relevant period, and Patel was chief of staff to the acting Secretary of Defense. Everyone remembers the Secretary of Defense. Bannon, however, was a private citizen during the time period. The Justice Department and President Biden previously authorized former officials to testify to the House Oversight and Senate Judiciary Committees about the Trump administration's attempts to subvert the election results. The two committees had requested these former Justice Department officials' testimony as part of investigations into, quote, any efforts by President Trump or any DOJ officials to advance unsubstantiated allegations of voter fraud, challenge the 2020 election results, stop Congress's count of the Electoral College vote, or overturn President Biden's certified victory. The January 6th committee is likely to seek similar testimony and perhaps expand on the previous inquiry. With respect to the earlier witnesses, the Justice Department explained that the extraordinary step of waiving any potential privilege claim was appropriate because the question whether former President Trump sought to cause the department to use its law enforcement and litigation authorities to advance his personal political interests with respect to the results of the 2020 presidential election constituted an exceptional circumstance that justified departing from its normal practice of protecting internal deliberations and communications with the president. The letter also made clear that Biden had decided not to assert executive privilege over the material given the extraordinary events leading up to January 6th, notwithstanding the view of former President Trump's counsel that executive privilege should be asserted to prevent testimony regarding these communications. That's a long-winded way of just saying, go stuff it. Second, the committee sent sweeping requests to the National Archives for presidential records of the Trump administration, which are governed by the Presidential Records Act and its implementing regulations. Those regulations delimit the roles of a former president and the current president on questions of executive privilege, but they have never been tested in court. In response to these requests for presidential records, Trump declared that executive privilege will be defended, not just on behalf of my administration and the patriots who worked beside me, but on behalf of the office of the President of the United States and the future of our nation. Meaningless, but okay. Third, and relatedly, the committee simultaneously sent similarly broad requests to a number of federal agencies seeking their records related to the inquiry. Those documents are not considered presidential records and thus are not in the possession of the National Archives or governed by the presidential records laws. As described in more detail below, if you can imagine more detail, the leadership of each agency, in consultation with the White House and Justice Department, will ultimately decide which of those records to release on a department-by-department basis, I guess. The immediate question is seemingly straightforward. Can a former president assert executive privilege? Unfortunately, the answer is neither straightforward nor without controversy, and the appropriate framework shifts depending on the precise parties, records, and constitutional claim at issue. Ready for this? Undoubtedly, a substantial number of the records and testimony requested and subpoenaed by the Commission potentially implicate executive privilege. As I explained in recent congressional testimony and have written about extensively elsewhere, the executive branch's current conception of executive privilege as a collection of numerous components, including presidential communications, internal deliberations, law enforcement material, national security information, and attorney-client information and work product, is extremely broad and encompasses an enormous swath of information. The first question in an executive privilege inquiry is whether the documents fit within one of these components, that is, whether they are the type of records that fit within the general scope of executive privilege. Quite possibly, a majority of the records requested and subpoenaed by the committee fit within that broad swath, and the records and testimony that do not fit within the scope of the privilege are most likely of little relevance to the committee's work. Once it is clear that the documents are potentially covered by executive privilege because their contents fits within the scope of one of the privilege's components, the second question is whether an assertion of executive privilege is appropriate, taking into account the circumstances of the inquiry, particularly Congress's need for the information. The Supreme Court has held that executive privilege is not an absolute privilege, but a qualified one that must yield when there is a compelling need for the information. An Attorney General opinion supporting a presidential assertion of executive privilege, therefore, must first explain why the information fits within the scope of executive privilege and then demonstrate that Congress's need for the information is not sufficient to overcome the qualified privilege. That second inquiry is the one that will be vital to this dispute, whether executive privilege can and should be asserted given the committee's stated need for the information and the gravity of the events under investigation. And as discussed below, there is also the question of who gets to decide whether privilege should be asserted, Trump or Biden. In its previous letters to former officials, the Justice Department determined that Congress's need for information related to the Trump administration's attempt to undermine the Electoral College vote is so compelling that it outweighs the executive branch's interest in confidentiality and makes executive privilege inapplicable. The letters made clear that the Justice Department was not backing off the executive branch's broad view of privilege and reasserted that the department would normally not permit officials to freely share this type of information with Congress. Instead, the letters repeatedly emphasized the extraordinary events of the post-election period and the exceptional circumstances under investigation. The White House reaffirmed on September 24th that Biden views the events of January 6th as a dark stain on the country and, as a result, believes the committee should have access to the information necessary to investigate. The executive branch adopted a similar posture in response to the 9/11 Commission, going so far as to share the highly protected presidential daily briefs on a restricted basis with members of the commission. There are also a number of historical examples that support the position that executive privilege does not apply to evidence of misconduct, including President Reagan's decision to waive executive privilege during the Iran-Contra investigation. The Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel has made clear in older opinions that executive privilege will not be employed to shield documents which contain evidence of criminal or unethical conduct by agency officials. And the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit has held that the deliberative process privilege, one of the components of executive privilege, disappears altogether when there is any reason to believe government misconduct occurred. That's quite up and up for a Reagan administration memo. The Republican-led House, along with conservative commentators, pressed this argument strenuously as a reason Obama could not assert executive privilege in the Fast and Furious matter. Notably, the Justice Department did not authorize the former officials to testify on this basis, nor, to my knowledge, has the White House mentioned this rationale as part of the reason Biden will not assert executive privilege. The executive branch has largely muzzled this historical tradition in the past few decades, perhaps because congressional investigations, particularly those by the opposite party, invariably cite wrongdoing of some kind. If executive privilege were inapplicable every time there was an allegation of wrongdoing, it would be of little practical utility to the executive branch. The Biden administration, aware that it may face a hostile Republican House or Senate in a few years, thus has an incentive to waive privilege based on the compelling needs of the committee rather than acknowledge that executive privilege is unavailable due to misconduct. Well, we'll see whether that's not something that a Republican Congress hopefully will never get the chance to find out because there won't be one. But I think a Republican Congress could probably say, well, we assert a compelling need then. And we'll see whether that does the trick. Still, the applicability of executive privilege where concrete evidence of wrongdoing exists is highly questionable. In response to Trump's statement that he would fight the committee's subpoenas on executive privilege grounds, former Fourth Circuit Judge J. Michael Luttig, who served as the head of OLC during the George H.W. Bush administration, told the Washington Post that with few notable exceptions, the historical practice has been for presidents to avoid asserting executive privilege to protect from disclosure information that suggests wrongdoing or potential wrongdoing by a president and or his advisors. Why? Because you don't want this exception undermined. The committee already has documents and information that indicate officials were actively engaged in trying to subvert the election results by pushing a false narrative of voter fraud, which would seem to be sufficient evidence to establish a prima facie case of misconduct. Thus, even if an executive privilege dispute arises, either because Biden decides some material needs to be withheld or more likely because Trump attempts to hide it, well, the question may be resolved not by wading through who has authority to assert privilege or whether the committee has sufficient need for the information. That will be the controlling question.
From netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
And to conclude here, it may be resolved simply by saying the executive privilege is not available because of the substantial evidence of misconduct. There's an awful lot more. Believe it or not, we only made it a little less than halfway through that gigantic article. But now, time to wrap up the weekend with Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Your reading assignment will be linked